My name is Dan Ogren, and I run a team of solution architects at Microsoft in the Dynamics AX R&D team. I've been with Microsoft about a dozen years or so and started working in AX at the tail end of AX4. So I've been in the R&D the whole time. Roughly about 2.5 years ago, we started up a new team of solution architects focusing on helping our customers and our partners implement AX 2012. As we moved up into that enterprise space, we saw that we needed a level of investment on the R&D side to assist with that process. So what you're going to hear today is a little bit about some of the experiences that we've had firsthand over the last 2.5 or 3 years or so. Okay, Matt?
Yes, good morning. My name is Matt, and I'm one of the solution architects on Dan's team. I've been with Microsoft since 2001, but before that I was with Navision. So I think I've been around a long time with this solution. So like sort of Dan mentioned, we're going to share with you a little bit of experience in terms of what is it that a solution architect typically does in an everyday role, and some of the challenges and some of the wins that we face on a day-to-day basis. Just to humor me for a moment, can I get a show of hands of solution architects? Okay, and customers? Okay, and partners. Very good. Thank you. It's all pretty mixed, so.
All right. And so how many of you are here to actually learn some new things about solution architecture? Okay. And how many of you are here to validate that you are a good solution architect already?
And who just got out of bed way too early?
All right. Okay, so just to set some context, we're going to start with just some background on the role of the solution architect in here. And it's about looking at a business problem and assigning and applying a technology solution to that. The important thing here is to think about it from an all-up solution. In the majority of the implementations we see today, very rarely is AX the only piece of technology that's coming in. There's usually existing systems that you're having to integrate with. There may be BI solutions. There may be some other ancillary applications. So when we're looking at this, it's the whole picture of the solution itself. And so when we're looking at trying to solve those needs, there's a short-term component to it. What do I do tactically to address that, as well as a long-term? And so what we really want to do is make sure that when we're doing the solutioning, that we're looking at the big picture and we're also looking at the long-term. And so that becomes a little bit challenging to keep in mind is where can I get the biggest benefit early on in the process, and how can I continue to evolve the solution as we move along? All right, so what's the role? A couple of key things to keep in mind that you'll hear some titles. So one of them is the enterprise architect. And the enterprise architect is one that typically looks at the strategic nature of the business, looks at what are the technologies that I want to be deploying over the long run. What are the solutions, or what are the systems that I need to replace over time? What are the investments that I need to make as a business in the technology in terms of ramping or in terms of even the types of purchases? So that's sort of at the top end. The bottom end, you have the technical architect. These are the guys that are dealing more with the technology bits, dealing with the development aspects, dealing with the sizing in the infrastructure, dealing with the complexities associated with the various components, even in the integrations. And the solution architect sits sort of in the middle. This is the one where they're putting all the pieces together. So if I look at some of the skills that we hire for, it's a combination of skills. One of them is they have to have functional domain knowledge and also deep product knowledge, but at the same time, you also have to be tech savvy. And so we have primarily in Microsoft, in my team, we have two roles. One is a functional solution architect. The other one is a technical solution architect. And in reality, the technical solution architect has two elements to it. One of them is more on the development, coding, best practices, that type of thing. The other one is on the infrastructure, sizing, performance, DBA type stuff. And so what we find is it's really difficult to have that one person that can do it all. And so I'll show you in a little bit some of the services that we provide. And we actually do it as a virtual team. But the ideal solution architect is one that has the domain knowledge first off, deep product knowledge, and has some semblance of being tech savvy and being able to actually do some design, as well as at a minimum be able to describe what best practices are for coding, what best practices are for technology and sizing, and what are the elements that you need to have in place for doing, for example, high availability. Okay? So a lot of it is this sort of blend of skills. And to be honest with you, the solution architects in my team have typically a minimum of around 10 years of experience and up from there. So just to give you a sense that what we've seen in the marketplace is that it takes time to be able to build those skills and that diversity. And so what we find is we try to take more junior people on and grow them over time. And it becomes a challenge to get them to have everything all at once. So what you need to do is you need to kind of ease people into the process and give them an opportunity to be successful in specific areas. Okay. The role of the solution architect in terms of the continuity, it starts really from the beginning and it gets very heavy and then starts to tail off. One of the things that we see today happen a lot is the solution architects will come in early, especially in like the pre-sales phase and maybe early in the analysis phase, and then they'll disappear. Or their involvement becomes at a minimum level. And what we find with a lot of implementations is that it's very iterative, the way the discovery happens and the way that you need to apply the knowledge and experience that you have, and you need to be able to be in a position to respond. And what we find is it's really difficult for people to context switch. So if you have a solution architect that's working on, let's say, 5 or 10 projects in some cases, if you include some of the pre-sales activity, it becomes very difficult to manage all of that. And so that's one of the things that's important in terms of some of the discipline to allow the solution architect to spread across more, because we know almost everybody does that. Today, for the partners that are in place, how many of the, let's say, how many are involved in 3 or more projects at any one time? Okay, how about 5 or more projects at any one time? Okay, so it's very typical that we're seeing that, and we've seen in some cases when the solution architects aren't as involved and they back off a little bit, they miss things. And so again, there's some discipline things that we're going to talk about a little bit later, and some best practices that by following those things, you can actually balance a lot more projects and make sure that you're doing the right thing for the customer ultimately. All right, so what are you looking at? So you're looking at things like the implementation quality overall. You're looking at design elements. What's the conceptual model of the solution? How does it all fit together? What are the components or modules that I'm going to use inside of AX, or feature functions that I'm going to use? What I'm going to leverage from either existing systems or perhaps some new technology. Maybe I'm going to implement BizTalk as well in this mix. So how do I know what the right solution is for how to do the integration itself? So what does that whole thing look like? In terms of the logical model itself, we're looking at some of the design elements. So we know today, very rarely can you implement a solution that has no customizations, right? And so what you need to be able to do is look at what that solution looks like and how does it best fit with the capabilities that exist within the solution. How do you leverage the extensibility patterns that are built into AX to make sure that the solution is tenable and upgradable over the long run? So those are important things that we find is a lot of the solution architects today can put in a solution, but it's a one-off. And you really need to be thinking about what are the implications of the design choices that I make, okay? And then, of course, infrastructure planning. And so again, from a variety of skills perspective, it's important that the solution architect can actually talk about the infrastructure, the sizing, the components that are needed. And in that context, not only just the production system, but your dev environment, your test environment, your perf environment, your staging environments. You need to understand all of those kinds of concepts to make sure that they're in place and that you're following best practices through there. It amazes me today to see customers going live without having proper code migration practices, right? Trying to go into production and they're throwing in fixes into the production environment without actually going through a level of discipline to make sure that the features or the fixes that are going in or the features that are going in are actually working effectively. Okay, so understanding those things become important. So what do we do as a team within Microsoft? So we offer, and this isn't meant to be a sales pitch here, but we have a solution architecture assessment offering, we call it, and it's essentially a bundle of services. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is not because I'm looking to sell you services, but I want you guys to understand the types of things that we're doing to improve the likelihood of success of the implementation and reduce the overall risk. Okay, so what we do, again, from an architecture perspective, is that we're in there in the beginning of the project all the way through to go live. And so we're doing things like the fit gap review, making sure that the gaps are identified appropriately and that we've got some semblance of what that solution needs to look like. We're also looking at what's coming in the future. What do we have coming up in this case, it could be a CU9. So just so everybody knows, there's not a lot of feature functions coming in CU9. But when we had CU8 coming up, there were a ton of things that put into the product. So we'd be looking towards the future to match up. We know that customers don't appreciate spending time and effort and money building features that are actually upcoming in the solution, right? So that's important. We try to do a reasonable job of getting that information out to you through the statement of direction as an example. But this is one of the things that becomes important, is keeping that in mind in terms of the future. And events like this give you a good opportunity to actually see what's up and coming as well. Okay, we talk, one of the things that we do is a solution design review. And these are topics that we typically do in a workshop format. And within the workshop format, we look at the specific implementation and peel out the key design decisions that need to be made. It could be things like, what is the legal entity structure and organizational structure? And I'll talk a little bit about that in the upcoming slides. But getting that context, what do the financial dimensions need to look like? What are the requirements around those things? What are the data security requirements? So those of you that have been around in AX for a while, data security can be a challenge in implementation if you don't make the right design choices. So we have things like XDS policies that allow you to do that, but there's a cost to implementing XDS policies, and it's usually on the performance side. And there's also some maintenance aspects of it. So those types of things, I've got a customer today planning on going live in the next 2.5 months, and they just discovered that they have data security requirements around site. They've already made the decision about the legal entity structure. They've already made decisions about the operating structure. So now what happens? What happens? Who gets blamed for that?
The solution architect.
Yeah, or Microsoft, because that should be in the product, of course. Right? So that's the first reaction is, that's Microsoft, you should be in the product. And the reality is the product is what it is, and all you guys know, it is what it is when it's shipping. Now the job is how do we best leverage what's there today and extend it out so that it'll actually meet the business needs. Okay? Then what we do is we pick a handful of the key functional designs. And what we do is we'll do a functional design review. And we're looking for patterns. We're looking for what would we do if we were implementing that solution. And the reason that we pick sort of the top critical ones is it's impossible for us to review the entire set of functional requirements. And what we find is that if we can pick out, let's say, about half a dozen or 8 of them, we can actually give you the set of patterns and the things that we're looking for, and then you can actually apply those to the other features as they're upcoming. And we do that sort of functional design, technical design, as well as a code review. Okay? The other important thing on the code review, how many are using LCS today? Not as many as we need. Okay. How many of you have mandated it in your organizations? Great. Okay, I want to see that hand raised the next time we get to a conference together. There's a tool in there called the code analysis tool. And what our recommendation is that when you're doing custom development, you're embedding the code analysis tool into your best practices. That should be used at least on a, I'll say, periodic basis, anywhere from a couple weeks to maybe a month, but you shouldn't be going longer than that if you're going through the development. And what you're doing is in that code analysis tool, you're uploading your model file. It's spitting out a set of issues that's raised, and you should be building in those remediations. Treat those as bugs, build them into the process, make that one of your best practices. And it's amazing if you go through that process across all of your developers, they'll actually improve their development skills in there, but it's a good secondary check. And the solution architect's role in this, obviously they're not doing the coding, but they should know exactly what's in that report and making sure that those practices are instilled in every one of the implementations. Okay? Performance review. What we do is, what we're finding in practice is that if we do the single user trace, and we're using, doing the trace analysis on the sort of the top key processes, we can usually find about 70% of the performance issues just by doing the single user trace before we get to the load and scale testing. And so one of the important things is, again, build that into your best practices, build that into your development, right? Doing the trace analysis now and analyzing that and remediating it will pay huge dividends down the road, okay? And then, of course, we will do potentially a performance benchmark. But we absolutely recommend that all of you make sure that perf testing, it's a functional requirement performance. That's the first thing. It's a functional requirement that you have, and what you need to do is make sure that you actually have built in the testing for that. And this is one of the biggest things that we see is not only we see a lot of situations where testing is not done adequately to test. We see everybody do the the happy path very well. What we don't see is actually the edge cases and making sure that the coverage is there. So that's common, but performance is also one of the other ones. It's sort of an afterthought. I'm really not that big. I don't have to worry about it. You absolutely need to make sure that you've got criteria, especially when you're deploying globally across a wide area network and managing those users. We want to make sure that you've done that up front. And then we go through and do a pre-go live health check. I'm actually going to show a sample of a pre-go live health check at the end, just to give you a sense of the things that we're looking at. We typically do that around 4 weeks or so before go live. The reality is you need to know about that almost up front because you need to be planning for it. So I want to give you some visibility into some of the things that we're looking at so that you guys can actually plan ahead. In some cases, it's been a bit of a surprise when we go in there and do these checks, and all of a sudden the customer goes, well, we weren't prepared for that. And it's for us, it was a little bit unfair for us. We should have actually provided that information up front. And all of you should be thinking about that as well, making sure that you understand what the exit criteria is that you have before go live and start planning for it. It can't be put on all of the team 4 weeks before you go live. It should have already been taken care of already as part of the process, okay? All right, so what we're going to do is just walk through a couple of things. For those of you that may have been at the tech conference last year, we did a similar discussion. We sort of updated it and revamped it a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the design decisions that a solution architect gets involved in. Then we're going to talk a little bit about escalations. That's one thing that we see on our team a little bit more often than we would like to see. And we can talk about some of the experiences and I think some of the ways that you guys can avoid having to have those escalations come to Microsoft. And also internally, I'm sure that the solution architects out there are probably dealing with escalations. Of course, not on their projects, but on some of the other projects that are going on. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the experiences there. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the implementation methodologies and some of the experiences that we've had. Everybody wants Agile. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means for us and some of the experiences that we've had on that front. Go live health check, and then we'll wrap up around a little bit on the governance side, time permitting. Okay? All right, so we talked a little bit about the entity modeling and the importance of this. Again, when we talk about the party, how many people here actually understand the global address book or the party model? Interesting. Okay. All right, so I get a little bit of hands, and like this is a little bit tough. So it is complicated, but at the same time, it's also a very powerful approach to allow you to have a common way of looking at all the people and organizations inside the system. And so I think that it's a little bit of a learning curve to get through there, but if you don't understand this, this is going to prevent you from coming up with the ideal design, or at least knowing that you have the ideal design. You may be lucky and trip up on it, but this is one of the important elements. So all of you out there need to spend time studying and understand the party model and understand the approach that's taken and the value. And why? It's because of the extensibility patterns. So when you're creating new types of organizations or new types of people, you want to make sure that you're incorporating the patterns that exist in there. And you want to follow the same model that we have. In fact, I'd argue that we actually have two models. If you looked at the CUS table model versus what we have for employee, there's a slight variation there. But the model that we're going to move forward with is more how HR is implemented using the party and the contractor and employee, or contractor-employee. Okay? Financial dimensions, another important element here. When you're going through and looking at the financial data, the majority of reasons that people are implementing ERP in the first place is for that financial data. In fact, I have a project right now that we've been running with that basically paused the project because they didn't have a grasp on what they were looking for from a data perspective. So in essence, what's happened is we've been driving a set of behavior. We've got a financial or a chart of accounts with all the financial dimensions established. And the reality is they're uncomfortable because they don't know what they need from an end solution on the reporting side. And now they're having to go back and backtrack. Huge disappointment for everybody that's involved in the project team, but it shows you how important that this reporting element is. And also important to grasp what it is that you're trying to get out of the solution. Okay? All right, legal entity structure. So there's a couple of options here today that fit naturally with the way AX works. And so we established what's called a legal entity, which was also known as company in the past. And what we found is that in practice, and this is where the solution architect sort of earns his money, if you have a situation where you might have a set of production facilities or sites, and you want to have them secured, and you want to have potentially a balance sheet for them, the right answer is actually to push the legal entity structure down to that site level. And then what you would typically do is create a head office that would also be a legal entity. And then you can use Management Reporter to actually consolidate that information up in near real time. So there's some really powerful capabilities that we have that deviate a little bit from what the semantics are that are built in, but they'll save you a tremendous amount of time later. That being said, there are some significant implications if you actually choose to put the legal entity at a lower level than the true legal entity. And what are some of those things? Does anybody know? Transfers, yeah, transfers is going to be a challenge getting some of the intercompany that has to happen, so you need to set up intercompany trade if you've got that. Shared service, shared procurement, or centralized procurement. Today, a purchase order is per legal entity. So if you have a shared services organization, you would not be able to create a purchase order with multiple legal entities or multiple sites across there. So that's, again, if you've got a centralized procurement, there's going to be some cost to that. Now, how can you get around that? Does anybody know? How about requisition? Requisition will actually allow you to requisition across legal entities. It will then create multiple purchase orders. But those are the types of things that you need to understand at a deep level within the product so you understand what the implications are, right? If I don't do that and I have to push and I've got shared service, then we get into XDS policies. And XDS policies, again, the cost to them, it's basically a query or a constraint against the data. And it can have implications on performance, so we need to be careful how that gets implemented. And so what we typically see is if you really need to do that, the recommended approach, if you can't push the legal entity down, is actually create a new attribute and put it in the table and secure against that new attribute. You can potentially secure against the financial dimensions, but the joins that are involved in that are very heavy. So it only works in certain situations, and it will work in some, but you want to be careful about how you apply that kind of logic, okay? All right. Single instance versus multi-instance. So talk a little bit about these are some of the design choices, and we hear this a lot. And it's not really, in our view, it's not going to change whether we move to the cloud or not. It's the same challenge that you have. So in the single instance, if you had share services and you have intercompany transactions, obviously the single instance works better for you. And the reason is because we don't support intercompany transactions across AX instances. Okay? So it's important to keep in mind. Do we have some customers doing it today? Yeah, but it's custom code if you're going to do that. So just be aware of the choices that get made. All right, so single instance, of course, reduce costs from management, right? Code management, you're only managing the one production environment, as well as all of the dev, test, et cetera. So it simplifies that. Same thing with licensing costs. There's some increased licensing costs if you're running multiple instances, primarily on the server as opposed to the users, because usually they're segmented. And then, of course, hardware, especially when you get into high availability. Excuse me. And as well as upgrade, because now you're just upgrading one instance as you move forward in there. Okay, multi-instance, where does it make sense? 24/7 operations, right? How much downtime is acceptable? Because there will be downtime. As you guys know, you recompile when you're applying fixes in there, so you're going to have to bring the system down. So what's manageable? What we find typically in a global deployment is it's very rare that you have 24/7 operations in a single location. It's usually 24/7 across the globe. And so if you actually distribute the instances and have one running in each of the regions, you're usually okay. You can run your batch processor, take the system down, and not have an impact on the operation. So again, these are questions that you need to be asking and what's acceptable. But when you get into these things, there are some benefits to doing that. Now, whether those instances physically run in the same data center or whether they run in separate data centers, that's some choices, and usually it's around latency that will make that call. But we have customers successfully running multiple instances that are supporting the globe, but they're in a single data center in a single country. right? We find that a lot with Europe because that's one of the other things we need to think about is things like data privacy in there, because within the EU, not just limited to the EU, but we certainly see that, is that they want the data physically in that country. And we've seen some customers actually make design choices that say, if I'm going to run in the US, I'm just going to have the US data there. Everything else I'll run in Europe. So you have to be thinking and making sure that you're asking those types of questions. Those are very difficult to undo after the choice is made, okay? Also, if you're looking at a business that's divesting, if you're going to divest it, so this is important to understand the strategic nature of the business and ask the right questions. Is there some upcoming thing that may change that? Well, if you divest, it's much easier if it's actually on a separate instance, because you can just pick this up and move it. That's one of the big challenges that we see. A lot of the buying decisions are, I shouldn't say a lot, some of the buying decisions for some companies are they have to get off their old system because they've been sold. And so they're rushing now to get the system in. And what happens? There's an end date when that contract ends. But the sales cycle usually drags on, and all that happens is the time compresses. And so, again, thinking about those things in advance on the proactive side when you can do it, it's important to do that so you don't have the downstream impact on others later. Also, now we've had some customers that have gone through, done the global deployment. They now have 10,000 plus users on the system. Well, now when you upgrade over a weekend, 10,000 people are impacted. And so those are some other things that you want to think about in advance is, do I really want to have a single instance and have that kind of impact on them in the future? We need to be thinking long-term, not just about the short-term needs. So those, again, become strategic decisions that you want to be thinking about early on because, again, as you guys know, you can't take the pieces and parts and upgrade them easily. Do we have people doing it? Yes, but it's a lot more effort to kind of do that staged upgrade after everybody's in a single instance. It becomes more of a migration effort, okay? And then also distributed code management. What we're seeing is that if you have an IT organization where you have different regional offices and each of those offices has their own development organization to look after their own local needs, it also works out really well. And there's best practices you can have for managing the code management. So with model files today, you can actually have a local model file. So you can have sort of a core model file that's applicable to everybody, maybe a regional model file, and then a local model file. So it allows you to manage that stuff. But again, thinking about that, what is the nature of the business? How fast are things changing? Do I have the local support? Am I going to continue to have that local support? And if I am, it may actually be better to have those localizations only be for an instance, because other people will be impacted by putting all the localizations in a single instance in there, especially if everything's turned on. Now, it's usually not a problem on the transaction side, but it certainly is an issue on the master data side, okay? All right, data import-export framework. How many people are using data import-export framework? How many people are experts in the data import-export framework? Wow. Okay, so we've got some work to do, and so I apologize for that. I think there's more things that we need to do. Certainly, we have a lot of entities in there. What I can, sorry, I shouldn't say a lot of, we have a lot more entities in there than we did early on. What I can tell you from a futures perspective is we're going to continue to expand. So when we talk about AX7, talk about what we're doing, it'll be a lot about the entities. So that notion of a staging table and being able to move data in and out through that mechanism, that's what we're going to continue to build on. So it's worth the time investing, okay? So I won't talk in more detail about that now, but LCS, did we ask that question about how many are using? So you've heard a lot about LCS. This also, from a futures perspective, is critical for us. We're going to continue to invest. And one of the important things to keep in mind is I think our long-term goal is to eliminate the need to run a project plan and to run statuses separate from the actual implementation itself. We want to drive into LCS where you can do your complete end-to-end implementation, tell the status of what's going on, be able to predict what the outcome is, know exactly what you've progressed. So look for some exciting things there and continue to leverage the tools and capabilities that are there because they'll only continue to grow. And there's some exciting things that we're continuing to work on that front. Okay. Just some of the tools in there. The important thing, too, is it's not about using every single tool in LCS. It's about using the ones that make sense to you. And Matt's going to show you a little bit about some of the stuff that we're doing with BPM as an example. But the important thing is get in there, use the ones that make sense in the appropriate phase in the implementation. Okay, and now I'm going to transition over to Matt. He's going to talk a little bit about some of the escalations and the process that we go through.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. So I guess if we take a look at our calendar, you know, we will start to see things pop up, such as I need to manage a customer escalation. And as a solution architect, we're faced with many situations where that customer escalation may be known to us and that customer escalation may be unknown to us. So what I want to do for the next 30 minutes is just talk a little bit about an approach on, as a solution architect, how would I approach this customer escalation? What should I typically do? What are the things I need to look out for, and what advice can I give the customer in turn to bring back, I guess, a satisfaction level and, at the end of the day, a positive result. But just a little tongue-in-cheek, I put this up here, the role of what we as solution architects do. What my friends think I do, typically buried in cables, pulling apart technology, going crazy. What my mom thinks I do, what society thinks I do, the IT guy, the solution IT guy, the nerd. What Dan thinks I do. What I think I do in terms of bringing about happy customers. But really, what do? Guys, it's about herding cats, right? It's about solution knowledge. It's about being able to manage customer expectations. And it's be able to communicate is really what the solution architect role is about. I will sacrifice a little on product knowledge, but if I have great communication skills, I'm able to bring the solution together with the help of some detailed functional people. But just keep that in mind, that communication is probably your number one priority. Let's paint the scenario, and I'll step you through. Now, I'm doing this because this is real-life scenario for me. This is what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. Not so much the customer escalation. We'd like that to be less, but it is a fact of life, and it is a reality. When things get to a point, it typically gets escalated to Microsoft. So our lives as solution architects around trying to level that playing field. So what the scenario is, your delivery manager's approached you. It's scheduled some time in your diary, and they've asked you to help out with a customer that you've just had no involvement with. You don't understand any of the background, but you're going to get on a call and you're going to find out what this customer escalation is all about. Typically, what are the things that we hear when we're on that customer escalation call? Misaligned expectations. We thought the solution was going to do something, but in fact it didn't. Or it only went so far and didn't fulfill the needs that we were actually looking for. Number one role, and I guess I need to raise my hand because I was in pre-sale for 9 years. The pre-sale consultant told me it would do it. We're after our commission, right? Sure, it'll do it. It'll do it. Jumping on that other side of the fence, guys, I can tell you, I now feel your pain. No clear fit gap. You'll be surprised the amount of times that I walk into an opportunity or I walk into a customer site and I see the list or the fit gap that they've actually put together. When I look at that, it's a few bullet points on an Excel spreadsheet, and I'm really like, how on earth do we understand what percentage of fit we have within the solution and how we're going to manage that gap list going forward? You'll see that the consultants, most times on a project, not most, but sometimes, particularly at that escalation level, the consultants that are working on the project may not have the experience on the functionality that's required to manage the customer's expectation. That's also a common problem for us.
The important thing to keep in mind here for all the customers that are in the room is that what you have to realize is that there are people that are new, and it's important to understand that they may be new to the project. They're going to spend time learning on not necessarily on your dime. That becomes a negotiation point. But the important thing is that you realize that it's there, so that you can actually mitigate. Because the reality is we know it's very difficult to find consultants to implement AX. But it's not impossible to implement AX. It's just important that you actually understand the expectations around there and make sure that you're providing the proper guidance and oversight that's needed, making sure that the partner's held accountable for those results. Back in the mid-90s, I hired one of the big SI firms to help me implement. What I knew at the time was they were very honest. They said, look, we don't have all the skills here. We've got a little bit of experience here. This is what I knew. They knew more about implementing ERP than I did. And I was fully aware. It was very transparent communication. That's what we're asking for, is have that transparent dialogue, understand what the situation is, and you can actually make it work. Okay?
Feedback. It's taking too long to implement it. We've looked at the project plan. The project plan states it's going to be 3 months more than what we anticipated. Why is that? The cost to develop the customizations may in turn pose a problem. Also, the number one problem, product bugs. Something that we come across daily in our engagement with our customers. The solution has these undocumented features which we need to skate around and support.
So how many are using cloud-powered support in their implementation? How many know what cloud-powered support is? Only a few. Again, one of the tools inside of LCS that becomes absolutely critical. And the reason that it is, if you guys have seen this, is that you get to a reproducible state on the issue very quickly, and it allows us to actually respond. And if we look at our days to solution in using LCS and the cloud-powered support, it has dramatically cut down the amount of time that we actually deliver, because what happens is a lot of the time is spent in just getting to that reproducible state. If you can get us there, which cloud-powered support allows you to do, it streamlines that whole process. So again, a certain level of discipline that you need to do to implement that, but a huge benefits. It benefits you in terms of that responsiveness back from us, because we're not spending time having to dig through and get to that reproducible state. More work on your side to do that, but again, huge dividends on your side if you actually leverage it. Okay?
So we've had the call. We've now realized where the customer is in terms of their escalation points. You've now committed to potentially go out on site and run a workshop to review the detail of the project. So as a solution architect, what is it? How would I structure that on-site workshop? What are the sort of topics I want to highlight with the customer to be able to uncover? Well, what benefit am I going to bring them? So I've put together a bit of a basic agenda for you, and you'll be able to grab this information from the slideware. But here is how I typically structure the workshop session that I have in a customer engagement. I typically do a project overview. Now, this is basically where the customer provides you with the background, and it gives you all the details about the project. What I typically do is use the project overview session to allow the customer to vent. Give them the opportunity to talk about the project, give them the opportunity to highlight the pain points, let them speak about what the problems are. Some of the typical things that I hear a lot, the gaps were much more than we expected. Okay? We can't understand how the solution works and how it's put together. We were promised we would go live in X number of months. Now, not only do we hear details from the customer's perspective, but we also start to uncover where potentially some of the project management areas were a little light on. And we can also start to see that resources from the customer side may not have been dedicated to the project full time. You'll also see that it's difficult to find people there who understand the business requirements on site. So locking down those functional requirements is something that's proving difficult for the customer. So I want to talk a little bit about what is it that we can do to support that process. We can't understand how the solution will work for us. That's something that a customer will give me information about on a day-to-day basis. So I want to ask the question of the audience and indulge me. When you're doing your functional design and when you're doing your fit gap, what is the process quickly that you follow? Anybody want to yell it out? How do you go about getting your functional requirements? Somebody? Okay. Interviews and ask why. Common, people follow that process. We meet with the SMEs. SMEs in a room. We talk about the business process. Somebody's madly taking notes. Then at the end, we go away. We sit in a room. We write up the document. We then present it to the customer for sign-off. It is a common practice that we see and can work effectively. However, I'm going to throw out an alternative in terms of how you would go about doing your functional requirements. The feedback we always get is, I don't understand how the solution is going to work together. So I'm going to suggest that in that analysis phase, we start introducing product. Start demonstrating core out-of-the-box features of the product. Do your interviews with your SMEs, sit down, segment the demonstrations in 2-hour lots, and in those 2-hour lots, we're going to run through sales order processing end-to-end, including all discounting. Now, what you're doing is you're starting to expose the solution to the customer in analysis. So instantly, they're starting to put their mind around the process of the application that you're demonstrating. I'm assuming everybody's AX, or have we got a mix? Yeah? Mix? AX? All right, if I talk AX, I don't want to offend anyone that's on NAV or GP, but you understand the process. They start to feel the language, they start to feel the business processes, and things that they had in their mind, which were typically from their old solution in terms of follow the bouncing ball, suddenly start to get flipped on their edge. Now, how can you, as a solution consultant or a solution architect, start to use the tools that are available to you? I'm going to jump over into LCS, and I'm going to show you two things. This is a familiar page to all of you, or most of you. This is Lifecycle Services. Lifecycle Services gives us the provision to be able to create projects for those that aren't so familiar with it. Once you actually create your project, then you have the provision to be able to look at your business process modeler. What we provide in our global libraries are some standard out-of-the-box core horizontal feature set of functions, business processes. We've then incorporated as part of our AX 2012 R3 release more industry vertical business processes out of the box. So you'll start to see here, I've got things such as my service industries. In particular, I've got all my retail back office capability available to you as well. So what it means is, as a user, I can copy that global industry or that global library and save it to my library. And if we just take a look at the retail industry here, now folks, I don't want to stand up here and profess that we've got every single business process mapped out and aligned, but what I do want you to know is the tool set is going to easily allow you to manage the process with your customer. We're doing a lot more work up front in the analysis phase, but I tell you, when it comes to UAT and when it comes to documentation and when it comes to overall looking at where these customizations in the business process flows, you've got this information done. All right? So what you're spending up front, you're gaining when you get further down into the project. So looking at something like our retail process, and if I just double click on that, you'll notice here under our market products and services, under our market to customers, you've got some developed promotional activities. You've also got some managed social media. I'll just find the one I'm looking for. This is the one I want. Develop and manage the sales and pricing plan. Analyze sales trends. In this particular process flow, what you can start to see is show the sales by category by store, show the sales by category by store, and then you show the sales composition by year. In that particular sales trend process, let's assume that there was additional user customization processes that we need to write. By dragging those in, I've got the full provision here of being able to edit them, putting in customization process 1, and I'm just making these up, guys, but you sort of get the message. It allocates it a gap ID. It tells me when it's modified. I've got the full description there. I can also then determine where it sits within my configuration, extension, integration, workflow, or reporting. I can then actually save that into the system. Now, by doing so, what I've done is created the customization list and the gap list within the business process itself. So anybody, including the customer, we can demonstrate the core. We can then show the business process. We can then drag the customizations that fit into that business process. So instantly now everybody is on the same page and on the same understanding of where the business flow starts and ends. Now, in addition to being able to do that, what you can do is export then a gap list. By exporting that gap list, you can see it here within LCS, but there's an option then to bring that in as a CSV and download that into Excel. All right. So that's utilizing some of the features within LCS to help you be able to build business process flows, use Core AX in your analysis phase, and get the product on board with how that's going to be managed. I did want to show you one other thing. Is there any retail folks in the room? Okay. Were you aware that there is a task recorder for retail, for the point of sale application? So although we have Task Recorder working for the back office, we also have Task Recorder available for you within LCS. Now I just wanted to give you a quick view of that. So not only do you have the capability of setting up all your pricing and promotional activity and all your business flows from a retail back office standpoint. I can also start to record them from a point of sale. So underneath our tasks, if we go underneath our edit transaction, I just created a new menu there called Task Recorder. For those of us that are interested, under the button properties, if we drop down on the action, you'll start to see the button property there for Task Recorder. So by selecting that option, what I've got the provision to do is start the Task Recorder very much like we would in our standard process, and I can actually record and process the sale. Now, once that's actually happening, I'll just choose my industry. Just give me one sec. All right, I can hit start. Now I can go ahead and I can perform a sales transaction. Let's just say I was going to add a particular product to my item, to my point of sale. I could also add my second item. And I could also add my third. And by doing so, you'll notice here in this particular situation, a mix and match discount or deal price has been invoked. Then what I'm able to do is cash that particular transaction out. Now what I can do is come along here into my task recorder. I can stop it, and notice there it said it was generating the documents. Underneath the setup area is where I've specified my path for my task recorded point of sale documentation. And if we just go and take a look at that on the desktop, File Explorer underneath my C drive, what I've got there is a task recorder directory. And then clicking on the APQC Industries, you'll see Matt's POS process. By clicking at that, I've got a recording using Windows Media Player, and I've also got the Word document in terms of being able to outline the steps that I just went through. So instantly now, I've got myself some training material. I'm also then able to upload that directly into LCS as a business process. So involving, like I said, the customer at this stage really does help them when it comes time to understanding what the product will do and how the solution will work for them.
How many are using Task Recorder today in the Rich? Excellent. Okay, and how many are using it for training content? Very good. Very good.
All right. So in addition, we talked about the project overview. One of the next topics that I typically like to discuss is really the overall solution design. Now, in the overall solution design phase, we typically look at things as what is the business process? What is the workflow? What is the reporting? What is the integration strategy? What is the enhancement to current functionality? Or what is the customization, the new modules that we may also be building? I also like to understand as a solution architect what documentation currently exists on the project. So I'll just switch across and we'll take a look at what would I expect to see from a documentation standpoint. In the analysis phase, I would like to see an architectural blueprint. Okay? I'd also like to see a functional requirements document outlining the modules. And here, let's start to get into the Dynamics AX or whatever solution you're implementing language. Okay? So we're using inventory management, not stock, if they're used to calling it stock. We're going to start using production, not manufacturing. Okay, so start to use terminology that's available to you on the modules themselves. I also like to see at this particular point the fit gap that we talked about, a clear analysis of the fit gap, and also a baseline project plan showing me the details from start to end. So that's in the analysis phase. Remember to introduce product. In the design is where we'll start to get more specific around the functional documents as well as the technical documents.
Even today, we're dealing with a few issues. I've got a large distributor out of Europe, and what they've done is they've gone straight from the requirements document right to coding. I'm missing functional design, I'm missing technical design, and now what happens is they put it in front of the customer, and it's not meeting the needs, right? So just some basic level of discipline that we want you guys to follow. The reason that we're showing you this is not because you can recreate this template and have to go out there and do an assessment. We're trying to avoid us. I'd love to retire the template that Matt just showed you earlier. That's our goal, is to get rid of that. Question? Sure. So the question is, usually customers, right. So usually customers don't want to pay for all of the documentation. So the focus is on the gaps, not on the actual fits. And I think that that's actually okay from a practice perspective, because you can document the setup and configuration of the system after the fact. It's more that we're focused on is on the customizations themselves, as opposed to that. So that's an acceptable best practice. What you need to make sure up front is that the customer knows how important it is actually to create the documentation. Now, whether you use an agile methodology or whether you use a waterfall methodology, neither one of them says don't do documentation. The only difference is on when the documentation is complete and the process for sign-off. In Agile, it's at the end of the process. In a waterfall, it's at the beginning of the process. But you absolutely need to have that for the customizations, for the gaps.
The functional requirements doc caters pretty much for standard, with the functional design docs on your customization. So that's very much an acceptable approach.
Yep.
What we often find also is the functional design has been developed. It gets handed to the technical team. The technical team will not write a technical design document. They'll go and code what they think the solution should be. And then when we present back to the customer, we're now in a situation where what they've developed doesn't meet the customer's needs. We often see that a lot also.
Yeah, the code speaks for itself, right, is the common thing that we hear from development. And I can tell you from practice, even internally in Microsoft, it doesn't. You need to go through that process, and in fact, you should have a level of discipline of what happens on the approval side. So as I showed you earlier, the things that we do, we actually go in and do the review. It's not about us doing the review, it's having the discipline in there to make sure that that's done. So when you have critical customizations, you need to make sure that you have that internal review process. Whomever that is, that's appropriate, whether it's a solution architect, whether it's a development lead, but you need to have that in the process. The only way to do that is through the documentation. Okay.
I also, at this stage, from the design standpoint, would like to see a testing plan, understanding what UAT, and understanding how, looking at those functional design docs, we are going to test the solution to meet the customer's needs. It's highly important that I like to add the testing plan as part of the functional design document. You'd be surprised how often that piece is one or two lines, one or two sentences within the document, but it's a very important piece that should be just as important as the design itself. We also start to like to see things such as the hardware and infrastructure sizing. Oftentimes people like to leave that to UAT. However, at this point in time, it's important that we have the usage profile specified within Lifecycle Services, which talks about the volumes. We then actually submit formally the hardware and sizing infrastructure document to the customer, so we're not left with any surprises. I won't typically spend too much time on development, deployment, and operation, but again, you could get a copy of these slides to understand typically the sorts of documentation and things that we would expect in each phase of that project. Okay, ask yourself what is the best way to define the FRD and the fit gap, and what often happens is, like we've mentioned, somebody with some knowledge just goes away in a room and writes it up and presents it back to the customer. And I'm reiterating again what we've just talked about in terms of the overall solution design. It's important to bring the product in the analysis phase. It's important to start talking the language and the terminology of the solution at that stage. It's important to start demonstrating the end-to-end processes and categorizing and grouping your functional requirements into those logical categories. All right. The detailed fit gap. When I'm reviewing the detailed fit gap at a customer site, oftentimes what I'll find is particular areas have some major attention, whereas other areas tend to be light on. So going into that particular discussion, I notice that everybody typically tends to focus more on the gap list than they do the fit list. It's important to understand the end-to-end process, and I'll tell you why. Is because 9 times out of 10 when we do the fit gap analysis, we find they're missing sometimes as much as 30% of the core functionality in that fit gap review. They often find that when they start presenting the product and the customizations well after development. Okay? So again, I'm going to reiterate, bring the product in early, because what it helps us do from a fit gap standpoint is understand what we've missed. It's almost like running through a mini UAT, but identifying the business processes up front.
One of the things that we see, again, it's very common on the customer side, the customers will supply the SMEs to the project. But those SMEs quite often don't understand the complete end-to-end process. And so what you have to use is techniques to make sure that you're drawing those requirements out that that specific SME may not be aware of. And by showing the application, by walking through the processes, it puts it into more context. And those SMEs will actually then bring in the right resources as necessary to make sure that we're getting the right answers. But it's so common, they may understand the happy path, but it's the exceptions that end up having the consequences to, the big consequences to the delays in a project.
So for me, the first day is typically spent just on those three topics. Project overview, understanding the overall solution design, and then taking a high-level view of the detailed fit gap analysis. When we move on to the second day of the workshop, here is where I start to get a little bit more detailed in terms of the customization. Now, keep in mind this is just a generic model, but you may focus more on certain areas depending on the customer feedback. But oftentimes we get the point surrounding and regarding the customization list. So here is where I like to start to look at the detail of how the gaps are being analyzed. And in some cases, what we do find is gaps have been listed, but functionality exists. So it's really important to understand that we as partners delivering the solution, also as customers, you understand the product and what it can offer you out of the box. All right. So I'll share with you that agenda. I'll make those materials available to you. I'll make this deck available to you so you can start to see the typical things that we look for when we go in and engage with customers and with partners. I wanted to spend a little bit of time now talking about some of the industry implementation strategies that we're seeing going on. And I think both Dan and I have had the privilege and the luxury of being able to work with many different models, some very unique to partners, some very standard. But I think the most common ones that we come across is obviously your typical waterfall approach, which the SureStep methodology was designed and developed around. That's the analysis, it's the design, it's the development, it's the deployment, and it's go live. What we are starting to see in market, though, is organizations and ERP applications are really trying to move towards very quick, rapid, agile approaches to how they implement software. And I think we take a look at some of our competitors, you'll see Oracle Business Accelerators being introduced into the market. And the whole idea here is it's cloud-based technologies that are enabling customers to get up and running on the solution quickly. We're also starting to see Infor moving in that same direction. So rapid deployment is a very common theme. We're starting to see the likes of SAP also being talking heavily about their deployment strategies and how we can get things to market quickly. So some of the things that we've talked about earlier on in the presentation is how can Dynamics actually help support that process. And I think with the uptake of LCS, the more we start to bring this in as a mandatory part of our project delivery, we'll start to see that most of these accelerators that are available to you, or the tools that are available to you, are definitely going to help you accelerate rapidly through your implementation strategy.
One of the things that we see, I think I've yet to see a project over 2 years where I haven't seen C-level changes in the project. Almost everybody that runs over 2 years and sometimes even a little bit longer. And so what we're finding is that can have a dramatic impact on the pace of the project and in some cases the goals of the project. So the more we can do to get value early on in the process, the better off that we're going to be in terms of getting that early on success. And the important thing is to build on that success. Because once you're out there, you've got some things moving, you can actually build momentum. So these long-running 2, 3, 4-year projects, we're seeing far fewer of those in general. And the reason, again, is because of the changes. In fact, we see requirements gathered 3 years ago that don't match up to the business needs of today. So it's important that we're looking at techniques where we can start to figure out methods and approaches that we can start to derive value from the solution much earlier than we've seen before. The other big change that we've seen is in a typical project, you go in, you work for, let's say, 18 months or so, and then the project team goes away. In today's business, that's not the way it works. Today, when it goes in, you put the first implementation in, you continue to refine and iterate. It's a living and breathing system. What we're seeing today is businesses used to, historically, every 10 years or 15 years, they would replace the solution. So they'd put it in, let it ride, and then replace it. What we're finding today, the pace of business change is so dramatic that it requires continuous improvement, continuous innovation. And so you need to be thinking about that for the partners here, making sure that your customers understand how they need to support the solution and how you can continue to add value to the solution and continue to adapt. It doesn't stop. It continues to move forward. Again, a big change and one that we want to see from a methodology perspective, that you're incorporating that and not everybody disappearing. Now, whether you hand it off to the customer to be in that state, that's perfectly acceptable, whether you do some complementary thing. But keep in mind that the solution will not remain static. It needs to continue to innovate and evolve with the business.
And regardless of your chosen methodology, I guess we're not here to say one way's right, one way's wrong. Each have their benefits, each have their weakness. Whether or not I'm using a waterfall type approach, whether or not I'm going down an agile approach with my deployment of an ERP application. One of the things I'd like you to walk away with today is to start thinking about some alternates to that process, or some options that can input into that particular process. And one I think we've found great success with doing some of the implementations we've managed ourselves through the R&D team is to really focus on what we call a conference room pilot type approach to deployment. Now, this sort of feeds nicely into the information we were talking about of bringing the product into the analysis phase of the project as well. But what we often find is if we break this down into 3 core categories, those 3 core categories being design, build test, and then deploy and support. So at those 3 high levels, we're basically running 3, possibly 4 iterations of our conference room pilot. It's bringing everybody into a room, signaling, I can't say that word, signaling out core business processes. CRP1, Conference Room Pilot 1, is to run through out-of-the-box solution, no data, standard demo data, no integration, standard reporting, and core application that's provided out of the box. First and foremost, we call that CRP1. What we're quickly going to establish out of that process is where we sit in terms of the fit. The customer's going to see the end-to-end piece and not just focus on, well, I don't like the way the invoice matching works. I really need to see how the invoice matching is going to post when I've got a miscellaneous charge or an additional freight charge. Instead of bogging down on that particular process, what we're doing is we're showing, look, here's how it works. Here's how we do the matching details. Here's how that's then attached to workflow. Here's how it processes and posts within the ledger, as an example. So very quickly then, what we are able to do is move then into our CRP2 model. Now, in our CRP2 model is where we start to look at where the customizations fit in, where the integrations are going to fit into the core process, and also understanding what are some of the key elements around business reporting that they're going to need. Now, I like to bite these off in smaller chunks as opposed to doing the whole end-to-end process. So one day you may focus on procurement. The next CRP you may focus on sales order processing. Then you may take a look at the manufacturing process, and I'm going to fall off the stage in a minute. So once we've got that CRP in, once we've got it defined, we then go away and we test. We build. When we build, we're then coming back and running a CRP3, maybe CRP4, depending on how many iterations, and presenting back to the customer the customizations that we've built based upon the detail we gained from CRP2. Now, I don't want you to think that there's no documentation associated with this. If people hear me talk about conference room pilot, when they hear me talk about agile, they're suddenly, okay, there's no documentation, we just run in and build it and we present it and we're all happy. I want to be very clear that no, that's not the process. The process is exposing the product, documenting those business processes using LCS, BPM as a tool to support it, iteratively then demonstrating that back through segmented conference room pilots to show your progress. What do you think some of the benefits? Does anyone want to have a stab at what some of the benefits are? Yeah.
We are following it at the moment.
Yeah.
We get buy-in from the customer much earlier on.
Number one,
They get using the system.
that is I would consider to be the number one highest gain and benefit is the customer seeing, and you're changing the mindset of the customer on the business process.
So for everybody who just heard that, it's get early buy-in from the customer. That's one of the huge benefits.
Yep.
Get the customer hands-on, exactly.
So the SMEs then, by the time we get to UAT and training, are pretty fluent in the way the application actually works. And the issues that I see on a day-to-day basis when I'm brought in as an escalation, customer doesn't understand how the business process is going to fit their need. Because we go away, we do all these requirements, we build, we then UAT. And they're like, hang on a second, that's not what I wanted. I didn't realize that you were going to build it like that. And then there's this backward and forward. Project grows. The length of the project, the cost of the project, everything starts to then tumble. Whereas this approach, we're biting off smaller pieces and we're then feeding that back to the customer on an iterative basis.
Just a couple other things on the benefits. One of the things that we've seen is that you're going to have discovery through this process. And so you need to plan in the future CRPs some amount of time to handle the discovery from the previous CRP and make sure that you're accounting for it before you move from one CRP to the next. But the benefits there is you're doing that as you move along, and it becomes sort of incremental changes, and it becomes a pattern of behavior and acceptance for the customer because they know they can actually make the improvements, and they'll see them the next time around. The other important thing is that if you put in 3 CRPs as an example, what we see quite often is when projects run late, without any engineering behind it, oh, we're going to move the date out 3 months. And then they're 2 months in, and they go, oh, we're going to move the date out another 2 months. It's a recurring pattern. In the CRP-based approach, it's actually much more straightforward because I can say, this is the amount of work that I have left. I'd add another CRP in. I know that my CRPs typically, let's say, take 3 to 4 months to do. I actually have now a more scientific method of being able to extend out my project and have a much better chance of being able to achieve that date. Okay?
Yeah. Question?
Yeah, so back on the previous slide real quick. So a comment and then 2 questions. So in addition to the buy-in, and I think that we've sort of said this, is we're validating as we go along. So before we get too far down the road, we make sure that the design is right and it delivers what it's supposed to. We catch it early.
Absolutely.
My question is, based on where we are here, where do you see the project team training? Is that part of that, or does that happen separate? And my second question is, when we do the CRP, especially the first one, are we using, let's say, Contoso data, or where do we start introducing the design configuration for the client so they can see it in their frame of reference?
Sure.
Validate it?
So
Let's repeat the question for the camera.
So the question was in terms of where do we sort of slot in the testing and the UAT was the first part?
Project team training.
Yeah, at training. And then the second part was in terms of, I'm sorry, I've forgotten it. What was it? Data, customer data, right. So yeah, where do we start to put in the customer data? So in the CRP1, when you're going through the standard out-of-the-box processes, you know, I sort of say there, just use the out-of-the-box, use the Contoso demo. If you need to set up certain inventory items that are batch and serialized and those sorts of things, by all means, you take advantage of that opportunity in the CRP1 to start putting in relevant data. What we don't want to necessarily get too heavy into in CRP1 is all their customers, all their vendors, all their specific inventory items, because at this stage, we're more interested in the out-of-the-box overall process. All right, so that's the first thing. When you get to CRP2, this is where I start to get a little bit more detailed in terms of their customer data. I start to bring in, when I'm doing the representing back and identifying the customizations, here I'll start to put in a handful of their products, a handful of their customers, a handful of their vendors, so they can start to correlate then the 2 solutions together.
So that training starts within the CRP itself, and then there's a test cycle that happens. What we typically do is that training becomes, again, incremental, so they get learning now, not a whole bunch of things out of context, but learning and focused on the context that you're actually working on at the time. In the very end, we end up doing the UAT, making sure the training is for the broad audience because it's not everybody in there. But we try to introduce more people to each CRP because as you get more of the solution, you still have to do the regression pass against the previous capabilities. Now you can actually introduce more users and extend out that knowledge. So it becomes now a gradual learning and adoption and awareness.
As opposed to a formal training class.
Yeah. That's
Correct.
right.
You group it around the CRPs that you run. So it's smaller chunks, if you like, over the process.
We call it knowledge transfer.
Knowledge transfer.
That's
Yeah.
a perfect
Knowledge transfer is a
description.
great description.
All the way through that first CRP, we actually get the customer entering some kind of data. So we start with a blank system.
Yeah.
We put in the minimum amount of data that we need, and we get the customer hands-on entering some of their own customers, their own products.
Yep.
So it's meaningful.
So that's a good suggestion. So just to repeat,
Knowledge
in this case, they're actually getting the customer in their hands-on, entering some of the orders. You can think of them as little test cases and running through those scenarios. And that's the best way is to get them hands-on and getting comfortable with the solution. Okay. The other thing is that from a steering committee perspective, the benefits we see is you've got a tangible output in terms of product, the look and feel. You can actually demonstrate that to the steering committee and the executive sponsors. It's very hard to demonstrate 55 specifications. It's like, oh, checkbox, but it's uninteresting. When I go into a CRP, I actually show them working product. I've got the context now with some business data in there that I can actually get a grasp of it. So again, it's much easier to kind of build on the momentum when you can show tangible results. Okay.
Another methodology which I've worked in, possibly not my favorite methodology, let me just put that out there, but certainly is one that has its benefits, and that is taking an agile approach. Now, for me personally, an agile approach works where we're continuing to develop the product over cycles and version releases. That's where I see an agile project works very effectively. In an ERP project where we've got a timeline, the approach is good, but also what I find in an agile project is it just never seems to end. The sprints just keep on coming. And the project then can actually push out a lot more. And I've been through situations where that's been very, very relevant. The end date becomes nigh because we just find more and more functionality and we add more and more sprints to the project. So that's one thing that we need to be very careful of when you're designing that sprint model at the front. Now, I'm conscious of time. We've got to get through a couple of things on project governance and timeline. But again, if you're interested in an agile approach, you can start to see here's typically what the phases look like. The stand-up Scrum meetings, which are typically daily, brings together what we call the Scrum Master or the Scrum Manager, as well as the team members that are basically giving an update in terms of what they've committed to from the day before. We also then start to look at monthly sprint planning meetings. In that monthly sprint planning, we then look at the resource capability, we look at the functional design of each of those sprints, and we start to then scope the work. Typically, we must have in our sprint planning our SMEs or people that are able to sign off there and then on what the capability and the functionality is going to look like so that we can go into our grooming and our ATDD, as well as then moving over into what we call our sprint retrospective, which is basically going in and looking at what we've done and then analyzing what the backlog's going to look like. And then lastly, we'll take a look at some of our explorative testing. Folks, I'm not going to go through each of them, but by all means, we can share this information with you. I've got about a minute and a half to talk about the project plan, talk about governance. We've sort of spent a little bit more time on things, but
Maybe skip that and go to the next.
in terms of walking the project plan, this also ties into our project review agenda. It's important to really spend some time on the project plan itself. I'll talk about some of the common findings that I typically come up against. The impact of the overall plan and timeline as a result of slippages and tasks is not necessarily tracked. I don't necessarily always see milestone definitions within the project plan, which causes me a bit of a problem. Baseline versus actual tracking, very, very important in your project plan. I do oftentimes see that that's not there a lot. Also, establishing what is my critical path in the project plan. Very, very important. Surprisingly, how much it's not in project plans that I actually see. And also resource leveling and resource shortfall and the impact that's going to have on the project timelines. Project governance, I'll be quick. He's looking at me. Project governance, an important piece of the overall project, and I like to call this out also within the workshop because some of the things that I see in terms of cultural aspects of project governance just don't exist. And those are, who's part of the steering committee? What are we discussing in the steering committee? How are we bubbling up the project plan and presenting it in a way that outlines these are the key tasks, these are my critical paths, these are my resourcing constraints. See what happens, steering committee, if I don't have this. So my plan should feed into my governance, okay, very, very easily.
And also we're looking for the transparent communication that exists. Quite often we see the partner doing one thing and the customer doing something else. It needs to come together, and the SteerCo is that point where all those decisions, if they're not being made on the ground floor, which is where they ideally most of them can, you need to have an effective SteerCo to get through those issues, and it needs to be transparent communication.
I also need to understand some cultural things on a project. It's daily meetings, right? It's understanding, even though they keep them brief, keep them short, but it's understanding where we are with the particular project. It's also looking at how to status track some of your issues and also how to manage those slippages that are coming through from previous days.
Okay, so we're out of time now, so we have a choice. We can carry on for another sort of 3 minutes if you want us to carry on, or we can open it up for questions. So can I take a poll? Who would like to just carry on for the next 3 minutes or so? Okay. And for those of you that want to leave, we'll let you guys walk out. The rest will carry on, and then we'll have a few minutes afterwards for Q&A, and we'll stick around a little bit as well. Okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the pre-go-live health check. So this has sort of become a best practice for us when we're going out and looking at implementations. And you can think about it sort of in 10 buckets, how we've grouped it together. So infrastructure readiness, which is typically all you tend to focus on is just the infrastructure piece. That's not enough. And so the reason that I want to bring this up now, I talked a little bit earlier, is that you want to know what the criteria is for go live well in advance of that so you can actually plan for it. There should be zero surprises coming into it. It should actually just be a checklist. Yep. Oh, I missed this thing. I can address it in there. But it's really important that this becomes part of the plan itself and integrated into the plan. Okay, so infrastructure readiness, business sign-off, security, data migration, integrations, code management, solution readiness, perf, monitoring diagnostics, and operational readiness. And believe it or not, that last one is one we see where customers aren't ready for that operational readiness. And what we're talking about are things like, it's inevitable that you're going to find issues when you're in production. But do you have the process well defined for how you're going to be able to take those changes in on a regular cadence? We see people taking in changes every day. It's an absolute disaster on the customer when you're taking changes on a daily basis because you're not actually testing properly. And you end up creating more difficulties and then having to roll back. Well, do you even have rollback processes in place? And so you end up tripping over each other. So you need to be very disciplined about having a regular cadence in there up front. And then you also have a way of saying, okay, from the users, can you live with this for the next week? Because that's when we have a next drop. And you're able to set expectations clearly about what's going to happen in there, and it makes it much easier to manage it. Are there emergency situations? Of course there are. You've got some things that could be production down or almost that critical. Do you have a process in place for that? So again, one of the critical things that we need to see is make sure that you're ready to go live by having these things in place. Same thing with all of the support procedures themselves. Do you have the help desk set up? Are they trained? Do you have both technical and functional things covered? So again, some critical elements there. So I'll leave that kind of with you guys. It'll be part of the deck you can read through. Think of this for us as essentially the checklist that we go through and look at, and we're making sure that all of these things are done. So what we really want to convey back to you is we don't want to have to do the escalations. We want you guys to be able to manage this stuff. We want you guys to be aware of the things that we're looking at as an education process and as a way of you and partners building the practice, making sure that customers are there. Also for customers to be aware of the level of responsibility that you take to make sure that the project is successful. Ultimately, the customer needs to own the project, take responsibility for the outcome. It's not a turnkey thing, I just hand it over and away I go. You really need to be in it from the beginning, take responsibility for the project, and we need to avoid the finger pointing. We need to come in, have a dialogue, and get things moving when we do run into issues. Every project has its issues. It's not about issues. It's about how you manage those issues, how you work through those issues. Okay? All right.
Good.
Thank you very
Question.
much.